should I carbohydrate cycle, right? Now, here's the thing. The thing is that carbohydrate cycling, it's a practice that I think bodybuilders have used for a long time, and that science is really just catching up to. So, why do bodybuilders like carbohydrate cycle? Well, and what's really the point of it? Well, theoretically speaking, for the bodybuilder, the thought is that like on higher carbohydrate days, I have more muscle pumps, greater muscle pumps, more focus, more energy. I can lift more total weight, right? So things are all around better for me. But the thought is that when I'm on a low carb state, it's easier to burn fat, right? So is there something to that? Well, actually, this hasn't really been studied since like early 2000s. There's a group out of the lab of Hansen's lab, and this is actually back in 2005. And what they ended up doing is they found that carbohydrate cycling, meaning training in a low carb state, triggered adaptations. What do I mean? Well, what are we trying to do as bodybuilders, right? What we're trying to do is we're trying to train our muscles to burn fat at rest. We're trying to train our muscles to burn fat while we train. And what causes that? Well, inside of the muscle, we have something known as mitochondria. And mitochondria is our fuel house. Essentially, it is the machinery where we burn fat, okay? So if you're a bodybuilder, for example, and you don't do a lot of cardio, for example, or your carbs are always super high, or the combination of the both, what happens is that your muscle basically says, oh, I'm never drained of carbs. I'm never drained of carbohydrates, so why should I build a machine that makes me burn more fat? Does that make sense? So the actual trigger to increase mitochondria is low blood glucose levels. Low blood glucose levels or low muscle glucose levels actually serve as a signal. Okay, you have a fuel gauge in your muscle. That fuel gauge goes down when carbohydrates are low, and the mitochondria goes, oh shit, what am I gonna do now? I gotta increase in number, okay? So basically that is what the trigger is for increasing mitochondria. So if I go in the gym and I'm gonna go hard all out for 45 minutes, guess what? I probably only depleted carbohydrate stores in my muscle by maybe 15 to 20%, max 30%. Well, that means your fuel source is almost still high. It's very high. Mitochondria has no reason to adapt. So how do I trigger and cause depletion without decreasing my ability to train hard? That's what you do. That's what carb cycling is all about. So what Hansen ended up doing is this, okay? They had one group where individuals always trained in a high carbohydrate state. They had another group where training session 1, they train in a high carb state. Then between training session 1 and the next training session for that same muscle group, they ate low carbs, like basically no carbs. So the second time they came around, they trained in a more depleted state, okay? What did they find? They found that at the molecular level, the people who trained in a depleted state every other time, meaning they carbohydrate cycled, burned more fat. In other words, like when they were training, the fat metabolism, fat burning was higher, and at the molecular level, they triggered a bunch of enzymatic adaptations, mitochondrial adaptations, to where they were better at fat burners, okay? Now, there was another study actually that was done in 2008 that addresses the next question you guys might have. And the next question you might have is basically, yeah, but I'm training in a low carb state. I feel horrible, okay? So this guy, this lab out of Yeo's lab in 2008, they did a study where they did the same thing as Hansen, okay? So basically every other training session, they train in a low carb state. They found at first that their performance, right, during intervals, they were doing interval training, like when you're sprinting all out, was low. But after a couple weeks, it was the same in the low carb state as when they were a high carb state. Why? Because their mitochondria adaptations, their molecular adaptations went up so high that they were burning fat at a high enough rate, okay, to support high intensity training, okay? So basically what it means is if you're carb cycling at first, the low carb days might suck, but eventually you might be like, cool, I can train low carb as good as I can high carb, okay? And that's something called metabolic flexibility, which Paul brought up earlier to me today, and we're going to have a whole question and answer on what is metabolic flexibility. So basically what I'm saying is carbohydrate cycling works really well, okay? For fat burning it works well, and for long-term insulin sensitivity it works well, and for keeping you lean on those bulks it works out well, okay? Because remember, if I'm always high carb and I'm bulking, what ends up happening is I start to become insulin resistant. Why? Because my mitochondria is getting lower and lower and lower because there's no reason for it to adapt. So whether you're bulking, whether you're cutting, carb cycling is going to be important. So how do I institute carb cycling? There's a couple of different ways that you can institute it. One way is you can have a high carbohydrate day, followed by a moderate carbohydrate day, followed by a low carbohydrate day, okay? If you're cutting, you can actually do like a high carbohydrate day, a moderate carbohydrate day, and 2 low carbohydrate days, followed by a high carb day. So it means that you're shifting it toward a priority of lower carbohydrate days over higher carbohydrate days, right? Another way you can do it is if you're training twice a day, one of my friends, Ray Radwan, he actually ends out training where he'll do legs morning and night. So if you trained your legs in the morning and in the evening, basically what ended up happening is that if I train my legs in the morning, I do deplete them, and then if I don't eat carbs from the morning to the night session, I train them again, I'm training in a depleted state, okay? So that's another way to do it to where, and then the next day you're eating carbs, right? So say that, for example, you had a moderate carbohydrate day before then, you come in, your muscle stores are kind of full, you train in the morning, okay? And then at night, basically, you're gonna train in a depleted state, and then next day you go to your moderate day again and you kind of start replenishing, okay? But that's the point. Those are different ways to carbohydrate cycle. If you are essentially bulking, I definitely recommend the 2-a-days because it's a way where if your carbohydrates are shifted to more higher days throughout the week, it's a way to at least get a depletion during your training and trigger that metabolic flexibility we talked about, okay? So now, what do you do when you're on your low carb days? When your carbs shift down, what should come up? Well, more than likely it's going to be a combination of both protein and fats to replace the carbohydrates, okay? Some guys, if they're not eating carbs at all, between that time, will essentially almost do keto, right? So, or modified keto, or like a modified Atkins diet. So in essence, during that time, your fat might be 60% of your diet, your protein might end up being like 35% of your diet, and your carbs might be 5% or less. If you're not used to keto, you might have 50% fat and maybe 40% protein, 5 to 10% carbohydrate, okay? As you become more adapted, then basically you'll actually be able to be more in that keto ratio that we talked about. One last thing I will tell you that I think that carbohydrate cycling can be very good for is adapting to a keto diet, okay? Typically when people go into a ketogenic diet, it's horrible, life sucks for them, and it's because they're not used to ever training in a low carb state, okay? But if you were to do this training method for 6 weeks, for example, you'd actually be able to transition very easily into a ketogenic diet and jump right into it because you're used to now training in a low carb state every other time you train. So it's naturally an easy transition. So let's summarize this up. Carbohydrate cycling, does it work? Absolutely. What's it good for? It can be good for burning more fat. It'd be good for keeping you insulin sensitive during your bulks. It'd be good for clean bulks, and it could be good for cutting to where some of your days you can sustain higher energy, and on days that you have lower energy, you can still adapt and train really hard, okay? We also recommend carbohydrate cycling for transitioning into a keto diet if keto diet's just been a bad experience for you because of the adaptive phase. Finally, there's a couple different ways that you can do it. You can have a high carbohydrate day followed by 2 moderate days and 2 low days. If you're cutting, if you're bulking, maybe you have a high carb day, 2 moderate days, only 1 low carb day, and then back to a high carb day. So you shift it toward the high in a bulk, you shift it toward the low on a cut, okay? But no matter what you're doing, just make sure you're hitting some depletion to trigger those mitochondrial fat burning adaptations. Thank you so much, guys. Definitely apply this. I'll see you next time.